The galaxy was once a beautiful place, full of life and peace. Planets thrived with different kinds of civilizations. Among them was the Velari, an advanced alien species known for their peace-loving nature and great knowledge of science. They did not believe in war, nor did they wish to harm others. Their technology was built for healing, growth, and cooperation. But in the end, their peaceful ways would become their downfall. War came to the galaxy, and it did not care about peace or kindness. The monstrous, horrible creatures made in secret laboratories by enemies of the Velari destroyed planet after planet. These creatures, made from twisted technology, were powerful and bloodthirsty. The Velari did not have the weapons to fight back. They trusted that peace could save them, but the monstren were too strong. In the end, the war came to their home. Kiriel was just a child when it all began. Her people had warned her that one day the galaxy would be at war, but she never believed it would come to her home. Her parents had taught her how to heal others with technology, how to use the Velari biotech to bring plants back to life, and how to grow food from the soil. She had never learned to fight. She believed in peace. But peace was shattered on the day the sky above her home burned. The first wave of the monstren attacked her planet, crushing cities, killing thousands, and leaving nothing but dust and ruins. Kiriel barely escaped. She was one of the few who managed to survive. Alone, with no family, no friends, only memories of a lost home, Kiriel wandered the broken lands. For weeks, she lived off scraps, hiding from the monstren who roamed the ruins. She had no choice. The world she knew was gone, and all she had was the hope that maybe, somewhere out there, there were survivors. The galaxy was vast, and Kiriel had heard stories of humans, the Terrans, who had once been powerful and strong. Maybe they still existed. Maybe they could help. She did not know much about them, but Kiriel had heard whispers. Humans were not like the Velari. They were known for being tough, willing to fight for survival. They had fought wars long before the monstren were created. Could they be the key to defeating these monsters? Kiriel wasn't sure, but it was the only thing she had left to hold on to. One day, after many long days of searching, Kiriel's luck seemed to change. She found an old, abandoned satellite, partially buried in the sand. It looked like it had been there for years. But something strange caught her attention. A faint signal, a weak distress call coming from within the satellite systems. It was a human signal, the old-fashioned kind, the kind that humans used long ago. The sound was broken, but Kiriel knew it was a call for help. Her heart raced. Could it be? Were there humans still alive? The signal was not strong, but it was a sign. Someone else, somewhere in this galaxy, was still out there. They might need help. Kiriel's fingers flew across the damaged controls of the satellite, trying to make sense of the equipment. Slowly, she brought the signal back to life. Help, humans, please. The voice was weak but unmistakable. Kiriel's heart skipped a beat. It was a human voice. Kiriel looked out over the barren wasteland, the vast emptiness around her. The monstren still roamed the land, their screeches echoing in the distance. She had to hurry. She couldn't waste time. Her people, the Velari, had been destroyed because they hadn't acted quickly enough. She refused to let that happen again. She packed what little she could carry, tools, medical supplies, and some of the advanced biotech equipment that she had salvaged from the ruins. She didn't know what she would find when she reached the source of the signal, but she had to try. Maybe this human could help her understand more about what was happening. Maybe they could work together to survive. Kiriel had no idea how long it would take, but she had made her decision. She would find the source of the distress signal, and she would do whatever it took to help. After all, the galaxy was not just her home, it was the home of all life. And if there was a way to stop the monstren, she would find it. With determination in her eyes, Kiriel began her journey. The world around her was broken, but her spirit was not. There was hope, and as long as she had hope, She would fight to find a way to bring peace once again to the galaxy. Kariel walked across the lifeless world, her feet sinking into the fine sand with every step. The once thriving planet she had called home now seemed like a forgotten dream, its green forests, flowing rivers, and bright skies replaced by barren deserts and twisted ruins. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not when she had a chance to find help. The distress signal had been faint at first, like a whisper in the dark. But after hours of tinkering with the broken satellite, Kariel had finally managed to make it clearer. It was a human signal. Weak, but alive. That was enough for her. She had to find the source. The world was quiet, almost too quiet. The monstren, those terrible creatures that had destroyed her home, were out there somewhere. Kariel knew that. Their growls and shrieks could sometimes be heard in the distance, but they didn't come close to where she was yet. She was always careful to keep her movements hidden, her presence unnoticed. She knew that even though she was fast and clever, the monstren were stronger and faster. If they found her, they would destroy her without hesitation. But the hope of finding another survivor, another person like her, was too strong to ignore. The signal was clear now. It was coming from a small, hidden valley a few miles north. Kariel had never been there before. The valley was surrounded by jagged cliffs, which made it nearly impossible to reach by any normal means. But Kariel had a few tricks up her sleeve. The Velari were known for their biotech, and Kariel had salvaged several pieces of their old equipment. One of these devices, a small hover pad, allowed her to glide silently across the land. She activated it now, the device humming quietly beneath her feet as she began to move. It was a slow journey, but she kept her focus. The landscape was strange here, with rocks twisted into unnatural shapes, some blackened as if they had once burned. The sky was an ugly shade of red, the sun dimmed by a thick cloud of dust that never seemed to lift. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As Kariel approached the valley, she slowed the hover pad, taking extra care to make as little noise as possible. The last thing she needed was to alert any monstren nearby. She hovered over the edge of the valley and looked down. Below, nestled between the rocky cliffs, was a small ruined structure. It looked old, much older than any of the buildings she had seen before. It was clearly a place where someone had lived at one point, but now it was empty and covered in dust. Kariel's heart skipped a beat. This was the place. She could feel it. The distress signal was coming from this very spot. Carefully, she glided down, her hover pad's silent hum blending with the wind as she approached the ruined building. When she reached the ground, she paused. There were no signs of life. The air was thick with dust, and the place looked abandoned. But the signal was still there, faint but clear. Kariel stepped forward, her footsteps light on the cracked earth beneath her. Her fingers tingled with excitement as she reached for the door of the old structure. The door creaked open slowly. Inside, everything was dark and still. The smell of old metal and forgotten machinery filled the air. Kariel took a deep breath and stepped inside. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning the area. The building appeared to be some kind of outpost, long forgotten by time and war. The walls were lined with old computers and equipment, most of it useless now. But something caught her eye. In the far corner, there was a small table with a glowing panel. Kariel approached it, her heart racing, as she reached for the panel. As soon as she touched it, the panel flickered to life. A map appeared, displaying coordinates that pointed to the location of another building, much farther north. But this wasn't just any building. This was a command center. It seemed important. Kariel quickly activated the communications device, hoping to hear a voice, a sign of life. The static buzzed loudly for a moment. Then slowly, a voice came through, weak but unmistakable. "Is anyone out there?" Kariel froze. The voice was human, and it was coming from somewhere nearby. She leaned forward, adjusting the device, trying to get a clearer signal. "Hello," she called softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm here. I can help. Where are you?" The response was broken, but clear enough. "I'm in the facility. On the surface. Need help." The connection went silent, but Cariel knew what she had to do. She had found the source of the signal, but the person calling for help was still somewhere out there, waiting. The only problem was that the journey would not be easy. The valley was filled with dangers, and the closer she got to the source, the more likely the monstron would be watching. Cariel clenched her fists. She had come too far to turn back now. She had to help this person. She had to. Taking a deep breath, Cariel set off again, more determined than ever. She would not let the monstron stop her. She would find the human, and together, they would survive. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Cariel knew one thing for sure. She was not alone anymore. Cariel moved carefully through the rocky terrain, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. The path she followed had become narrower, the once barren land now filled with craggy hills and hidden caves. The air was thick, and the sun barely shone through the dark clouds. The wind howled across the valley, making her feel even more alone than before. The distress signal had led her to this place, a large old facility hidden deep within the valley, surrounded by sharp rocks and overgrown vegetation. She wasn't sure who had left the signal, but her heart raced with the hope that it could be another survivor, maybe even a human like the voice on the transmission. As Cariel approached the facility, she slowed her pace. She had no idea what awaited her inside. The building looked like it had been abandoned for years, the walls covered in moss, and the windows shattered. Yet a faint hum of life came from within, signaling that something or someone was still there. She stepped carefully through the rusted doors, feeling the chill of the darkened hall. The place smelled old, with the scent of dust and metal in the air. The floor creaked under her feet as she moved forward. It seemed that the building had been built for humans, though it had clearly been forgotten by time and war. "Hello," Cariel called out, her voice echoing off the cold walls. "Is anyone here?" At first, there was no response. But then, from the shadows in the far corner of the room, came a low groan. Cariel's heart skipped a beat. She took a step closer, her senses alert. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. He was a man, dirty, disheveled, and dressed in tattered military clothing. His face was weathered and grim, his eyes narrowed as he stepped forward. He was tall, his movements stiff as though he hadn't used his limbs in a long time. His hair was dark and matted, and his skin was pale, as if he had been in this place for far too long. "Who are you?" the man rasped, his voice hoarse from disuse. His eyes studied Cariel with caution, as though he wasn't sure whether to trust her. Cariel froze. This was the person who had sent the distress signal. He was human, just as she had hoped. But he didn't seem happy to see her. I'm Cariel," she said carefully, making sure her voice was calm. "I heard your signal. I came to help." The man's eyes narrowed even more. "Help? I don't need help," he muttered, though his voice trembled slightly, as if he were hiding his weakness. "I've been alone here for months. I don't need anyone." Cariel could see the pain in his eyes, but she didn't step back. Instead, she held her ground. She could tell that he was desperate, but also wary of strangers. It was understandable. He had probably seen many people come and go, all of them lost to the chaos of the galaxy. But Cariel was different. She had no intention of leaving him in his time of need. "Please," she said softly, "I came from the other side of this valley. There's nowhere safe anymore, but we can find a way to survive together." The man hesitated, then seemed to soften just a little. He didn't speak for a long time. Instead, he turned and gestured for Cariel to follow him. "I'm Ethan," he finally said, his voice quieter now. "I've been here alone, trying to survive, but it's not easy." Cariel followed Ethan into the heart of the facility. The inside of the building was sparse, with only the barest essentials scattered about. A few broken pieces of technology, old food rations, and makeshift bedding. It was clear that Ethan had been trying to make do with whatever he could find. Ethan led Cariel to a small room in the back of the building. Inside, there was a strange machine in the corner, flickering with weak lights. It looked like some kind of old communication device. Ethan knelt beside it, fiddling with the wires. "This is how I've been trying to reach anyone out there," Ethan explained, his fingers moving swiftly across the machine. "But no one's answered until now." Cariel watched him work, impressed by his skill. Ethan clearly had a mind for technology, just like her. It seemed that despite the hardships, he hadn't lost his ability to adapt and survive. After a few minutes, the machine gave a soft peep. The signal was clear again. Ethan looked at Cariel, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you for answering," he said, his voice steady now. "I don't know how much longer I could have lasted in here." Cariel nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose. "You don't have to do it alone anymore. Together, we can figure out a way to survive." Ethan looked at her, his face softening for the first time. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe we can." But even as they shared this moment of connection, neither of them knew what dangers awaited them outside the facility. The monstren were still out there, and the world around them was unforgiving. But for the first time in a long while, they both had something to hold on to. Cariel and Ethan spent the next few days inside the old facility. The walls were silent, only the occasional buzz of the machine in the corner breaking the stillness. At first, they didn't speak much. Cariel focused on studying the communication device, trying to find a way to improve the signal. Ethan spent his time checking the area for any potential threats. The monstren were never far away, and they both knew it. Ethan had a hardened look in his eyes. He was a soldier, trained to survive in the worst of conditions. He knew how to handle weapons, how to fight, and how to protect himself. He didn't trust easily. Cariel could tell that from the moment they met. His eyes were filled with suspicion when she first approached him, but she didn't mind. She understood. She wasn't like him. The Velari were a peaceful people, and trust was something that came naturally to them. But here, in this broken world, trust was a rare commodity. As the days passed, Cariel found herself admiring Ethan's resourcefulness. He had turned the broken facility into a small fortress, using the old equipment to set up defenses. He was constantly on alert, always watching for any signs of danger. Cariel, on the other hand, felt out of place. She had spent most of her life using technology to heal, to help, not to fight. But she knew that the world had changed, and she had to change with it. She had to learn how to survive. "Can you teach me how to use a weapon?" Cariel asked one afternoon, her voice soft but steady. Ethan looked up from the broken rifle he had been repairing. He seemed surprised at her request, then nodded slowly. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice gruff. "It's not easy, and it's not pretty. If you're going to fight, you've got to be ready to do whatever it takes." Cariel nodded. She was ready. She had to be. The monstren were out there, and they would stop at nothing to destroy anything in their path. If she was going to survive, if she was going to help others, she had to learn how to fight. Ethan handed her a rifle, its metal surface cold and rough. Cariel took it carefully, holding it with both hands. She had never touched a weapon like this before, but she wasn't afraid. She knew it was just another tool, like the technology she had used back on her planet. The difference was that this tool was made for survival, not for healing. "First, you need to understand how it works," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't like the biotech you're used to. It's all about precision and control. You need to know how to aim, how to shoot, and most importantly, how to stay calm under pressure." Cariel listened carefully, her focus intense. She could see that Ethan was a man who had learned to survive, and his teachings were invaluable. She tried to follow his instructions, aiming the rifle at a target he had set up in the corner of the room. It was difficult, and her hands were shaky at first, but with each passing moment, she felt herself growing more confident. The first shot missed. She didn't expect it to hit, but she didn't let that discourage her. Ethan didn't say anything, just nodded for her to try again. Cariel took a deep breath, steadying her hands. This time, when she pulled the trigger, the shot hit the target. Not perfectly, but enough to make her smile. "Not bad," Ethan said, his eyes narrowing in approval. "You've got the hang of it. Just keep practicing. It'll get easier." Cariel nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She wasn't just a healer anymore. She was learning to fight for survival. The next few days were spent in a similar routine. Ethan would show her how to handle weapons, how to stay alert, how to move silently through the facility without drawing attention. In return, Cariel shared her knowledge of biotech and advanced technology. She taught him how to use some of the Velari devices she had salvaged, and in turn, he showed her how to use the weapons she would need to defend herself. Despite their differences, Cariel and Ethan began to work together. They started to trust each other, not completely, but enough to know that they were stronger as a team. Cariel admired Ethan's strength and determination. He was a survivor, someone who had seen the worst of the galaxy and still kept going. Ethan, in turn, found Cariel's kindness and hope for a better world surprising. She reminded him of what he had lost, of the life he had once fought to protect. But there were still dangers. Every night, the monstren grew closer. They could hear their howls in the distance, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground beneath them. Cariel and Ethan knew that it wouldn't be long before they were forced to leave the safety of the facility and face the world outside. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the facility, Ethan turned to Cariel. His face was serious, his eyes focused. "We can't stay here forever. We need to move before they find us. There's a place up north, a safe zone where people are trying to rebuild. It's our best chance for survival." Cariel listened carefully. She had heard rumors of such places, but she wasn't sure if they were real. Still, the thought of hope, of a chance to rebuild, made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Let's go," Cariel said, her voice steady. "We'll make it. Together." The morning sun barely broke through the thick cloud cover as Cariel and Ethan prepared to leave the safety of the old facility. They knew that the monstren were close, and the longer they stayed, the higher the risk of being found. It was time to move. They had a destination, an old safe zone to the north, rumored to be a place where people were rebuilding, where survival might still be possible. Cariel packed the last of their supplies, carefully checking their equipment. She had learned a lot over the past few days, from using weapons to handling the survival tools she had salvaged. Ethan was ready, too, though he looked less sure than Cariel felt. His eyes were focused, scanning their surroundings. The air felt heavy, as if the world itself was waiting for something terrible to happen. "Are you ready?" Cariel asked quietly, adjusting the strap of her pack. Ethan nodded, though his face was set in a grim expression. "We'll have to move fast," he said. "The monstren won't wait for us to get comfortable." Cariel glanced out at the desolate landscape beyond the facility. The land stretched out in all directions, broken and scarred from the destruction caused by the war. The sky was a dull gray, and the wind howled like a distant warning. But there was no turning back now. They had a chance to survive, and they had to take it. They set off, moving quickly but cautiously. The path ahead was difficult, with rough terrain and crumbling ruins blocking their way. Every step felt like it could be their last. Cariel could feel the weight of the journey pressing on her shoulders, but she pushed it aside. She had to stay strong, for both of them. Ethan's silence only reminded her of how much more he had endured, how much more he had lost. As they walked, Cariel noticed that Ethan was constantly looking over his shoulder, his eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. He was always on alert, and Cariel couldn't help but admire his instincts. He had learned to survive by being aware of everything around him, and she was starting to understand why. The world they lived in now was one where danger could be found at every turn. After several hours of walking, they stopped for a brief rest. Carriel pulled out the last of their water supply, handing Ethan a bottle before taking one herself. The silence between them was comfortable, though both of them knew it was only temporary. They had to keep moving. "We should reach the first checkpoint by nightfall," Ethan said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "From there, it's a day's walk to the safe zone. We'll have to be careful after that." Carriel nodded. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice thoughtful. "If we can find this safe zone, maybe we can rebuild something. Maybe we can help others. It doesn't have to be like this forever." Ethan gave her a small, tired smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I used to think like that," he said quietly. "But things aren't the way they used to be. It's not just the monstron we have to worry about. There are people out there, too. People who will do whatever it takes to survive, even if it means hurting others." Carriel didn't say anything for a moment. She understood. She had seen the darkness in the galaxy, the way people could turn on each other when there was no hope left. But she refused to believe that all was lost. She couldn't. Not after everything she had seen. Not after meeting Ethan. "We won't let that happen," Carriel said, her voice firm. "We'll make sure we're strong enough to protect what's left." Ethan didn't reply, but Carriel could see the faint flicker of hope in his eyes. It was a small thing, but it was enough to keep her going. As the sun began to set, they pressed on. The wind grew colder, and the shadows stretched longer. The landscape became more treacherous, with deep ravines and sharp rocks that made their progress slow. Carriel had to be careful with each step, but she didn't mind. She knew they couldn't afford to stop. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, distant but unmistakable. A low growl, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the rocks. Carriel's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Ethan, her eyes wide with concern. "They found us," Ethan said, his voice low and tense. He reached for his rifle, checking the chamber. "Get ready." Carriel nodded, her hand instinctively going to the weapon at her side. They had no time to waste. The monstron were getting closer, and they would need to defend themselves. They moved quickly, finding a small outcrop of rocks to take cover behind. Carriel could hear the growling now, growing louder with every passing second. The monstron were hunting, and they were getting closer. She could feel the tension in the air, the sense that something terrible was about to happen. Ethan looked over at her, his face grim. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "If they find us, we have to be ready." Carriel nodded, her body tensed and alert. She could hear the monstron now, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground beneath them. She didn't know how many there were, but she knew that if they were spotted, they would be overwhelmed. Minutes passed like hours, the sound of the monstron growing louder. Carriel's heart was pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Ethan was right. They had to stay quiet, stay hidden. If they could just wait for the monstron to pass, they could continue on their journey. But the growling stopped suddenly. The silence was worse than the sound. Carriel held her breath, straining to hear anything that might give away their position. She looked at Ethan, who was staring out from behind the rocks, his eyes sharp and focused. Then, without warning, a monstron appeared, its massive shape looming in the fading light. Carriel's breath caught in her throat. Carriel's heart raced as the monstron appeared before them. It was massive, its body covered in thick, leathery skin that glistened in the dim light. Its eyes were glowing a sickly yellow, and its mouth opened with a low guttural growl, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The creature was scanning the area, its senses sharp and deadly. Carriel held her breath, pressing herself against the rocks, praying that the monstron wouldn't spot them. Ethan was already in position, his rifle aimed and steady. His eyes never left the monstron. He knew that the only chance they had was to stay hidden until the creature passed. But Carriel could see the way Ethan's muscles were tense, ready to spring into action if needed. She trusted him, but she knew the monstron were unpredictable. They could attack at any moment. The monstrum took a few slow, deliberate steps forward. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were listening for any sounds. The growling stopped, and for a brief moment, the air was eerily still. Cariel could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her breath shallow and quick. She slowly reached for her weapon, her fingers trembling. Then, as if sensing the movement, the monstrum's head snapped toward them. Its glowing eyes locked onto their hiding spot. Cariel froze. There was no way to hide now. The creature had seen them. Ethan didn't hesitate. With a sharp command, he whispered, "Run." He leaped from behind the rocks, rifle raised, and fired a shot at the monstrum. The loud crack of the rifle echoed across the valley, but the shot only grazed the creature's thick hide. The monstrum roared in anger, charging forward with terrifying speed. Cariel was already moving, instinctively running alongside Ethan. Her heart raced as she sprinted, trying to put as much distance between them and the monster as possible. The ground beneath her feet felt uneven, rocks and debris slowing her down, but she pushed herself harder. The monstrum's massive form thundered behind them, its footsteps shaking the earth. Cariel could hear its breath, hot and ragged, as it chased after them. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Ethan leading the way, his movements swift and sure. He knew the terrain better than she did, and she trusted him to guide them to safety. They reached the edge of a steep cliff, and Ethan skidded to a stop. Cariel followed his lead, her feet slipping on the loose rocks. She caught herself just in time, her heart pounding in her chest. The monstrum was only a few steps behind them now, its massive claws scraping the ground. "We need to climb," Ethan shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the cliffside. Without wasting another second, Cariel scrambled up the rocks, her hands finding purchase in the jagged edges. The monstrum was relentless, its growls growing louder as it too began to scale the cliff. Cariel's fingers ached, but she kept climbing, determined not to let the creature catch them. Ethan was ahead of her, moving with a speed and precision that seemed almost unnatural. He had clearly done this before, and Cariel followed his lead, focusing only on her next handhold, her next step. The wind howled around them, making it harder to hear the monstrum's movements, but Cariel could still feel the weight of its pursuit. With one final push, Cariel reached the top of the cliff. She pulled herself over the edge and collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Ethan was already standing, his back to her, watching the monstrum as it struggled to climb the cliff. It was close, but the monstrum was too large, its movements too clumsy to follow them up the steep rocks. Cariel could see the creature's frustration as it roared into the sky, its massive form swaying as it tried to find a way up. "We're safe for now," Ethan said, his voice steady but breathless. He turned to Cariel, his eyes locked onto hers. "But we can't stay here long. It will eventually give up and find another way around. We need to keep moving." Cariel nodded, her mind racing. They had narrowly escaped, but they knew it wasn't over. The monstrum wouldn't give up easily, and there would be more dangers ahead. But for the first time since their journey began, Cariel felt a flicker of hope. They had survived. Ethan's calm demeanor made her feel like they had a real chance. He was right. Staying still wasn't an option. They had to keep moving, keep pushing forward if they wanted to make it to the safe zone. "I'm ready," Cariel said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her clothes. She felt a new determination inside her, stronger than before. They had faced the monstrum, and they had won. Ethan gave her a quick glance, then turned back to the path ahead. "Good. Let's go." They moved quickly, staying close to the cliff's edge and keeping their movements silent. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley. The cool evening air brushed against Cariel's skin, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was focused on the journey ahead, on the promise of the safe zone that lay farther north. Hours passed as they continued through the rugged terrain, their pace steady but cautious. They couldn't afford to rest for long, not with the threat of the monstrum still looming. As the night grew darker, Cariel felt the exhaustion creeping in. Her muscles ached, and her eyes felt heavy, but she refused to slow down. "We'll make it," she thought to herself. "We have to." Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. "We'll make it," he said, his tone softer now. It was almost as if he could read her mind. "We're stronger together." And for the first time since their journey began, Cariel allowed herself to believe him. The days seemed to stretch on forever as Cariel and Ethan pressed forward, their bodies tired but their spirits determined. The monstren were still a constant threat, but they had learned how to move silently and carefully. Every night, they camped in hidden spots, always watching for danger, never letting their guard down. The world was different now, and they had to be different too. The landscape around them was harsh. The cold wind swept across the barren land, and the ground was rough and unforgiving. Yet through it all, Cariel felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. Each step brought them closer to their goal, and with each passing day, she grew stronger, both physically and mentally. Ethan had taught her how to fight, how to survive, but more than that, he had taught her how to hope. As they neared the safe zone, the air began to feel different. There was a quiet stillness in the air, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. When they finally saw it, a small, makeshift settlement tucked away in a valley, surrounded by high cliffs that offered some protection from the outside world. Ethan's eyes lit up when he saw the settlement. "We're close," he said, his voice filled with relief. "This is it, Cariel. The safe zone." Cariel looked ahead, her heart racing. She had heard stories of places like this, where people were rebuilding, where hope was alive. But seeing it with her own eyes was different. She could feel the weight of everything they had been through, every hardship, every loss, and in that moment, it all seemed worth it. They made their way down the final stretch, keeping low and cautious. The settlement was small, but it was bustling with activity. People were moving about, working together, rebuilding what had been destroyed. It was a sight Cariel had never thought she would see again. When they reached the outer edge of the settlement, they were greeted by a group of guards. Their eyes were wary, but they lowered their weapons when they saw that Cariel and Ethan weren't a threat. "We've been expecting you," one of the guards said, his voice calm but firm. "Ethan, right? We heard about you." Ethan nodded, but his face remained serious. "We need to speak to the leader," he said. "It's important." The guard didn't hesitate. "Follow me." They were led through the settlement, passing by makeshift homes and gathering spaces. There was a small school where children were being taught, and a clinic where injured people were receiving care. It was nothing like the cities Cariel had known before the war, but it was something. It was a beginning. At the center of the settlement stood a small, well-guarded building. The guard knocked on the door before entering, and Cariel and Ethan followed him inside. There, sitting at a table covered with maps and charts, was a woman who appeared to be in her 40s. Her dark hair was pulled back into a practical bun, and her eyes were sharp and calculating. "Welcome," she said, standing to greet them. "I'm Commander Lyra. You must be Ethan and Cariel." Ethan nodded. "We've traveled a long way to get here. We need your help." Lyra motioned for them to sit. "We've heard about the monstren. We know how dangerous they are. What's your plan?" Ethan glanced at Cariel before answering. "We're looking for a way to fight back. We can't keep hiding forever. We need to rebuild. We need to protect ourselves." Cariel took a deep breath. "I've seen what people can do when they come together," she said, "and I believe we can do that here. The monstren are a threat, but they're not invincible. If we work together, if we share our knowledge and skills, we can find a way to stop them." Commander Lyra listened closely, her expression thoughtful. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "You're right. We've been rebuilding for a long time, but we haven't had the resources or the manpower to properly defend ourselves. We're not strong enough on our own, but maybe, with your help, we can change that." Cariel felt a surge of hope. I can teach people how to use technology, how to heal, how to work together to protect each other. We have the knowledge. We just need the strength. Lyra looked at both of them, her eyes calculating. I'll need to consult with the council. But if you're willing to help us fight, I think we can make this work. Ethan stood up, his expression hardening. We don't have time to waste. The Monstren are getting closer. We need to act fast. Lyra nodded. I understand. We'll gather the people. We'll prepare for what's coming. She looked at Cariel and Ethan, a new determination in her eyes. You've brought hope to a place that was starting to lose it. Now, it's time to rebuild. Together. As Cariel and Ethan left the room, a feeling of purpose settled over them. This was it. They had made it. They had found a place where they could rebuild, where they could help others survive. The road ahead was still dangerous, and there would be challenges, but they were no longer alone. Cariel looked at Ethan, her heart full. We did it, she said, her voice filled with awe. We found hope. Ethan gave her a small smile, a rare moment of softness on his face. We found it together. And for the first time in a long time, Cariel believed that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild a world worth fighting for.